Thank you all for joining us today, and welcome. I'm Jesse Green, Senior Fellow at the Richmond Center at Columbia University. Today's discussion of the oil price crash and the shifting energy landscape is brought to you by the Center on Global Policy at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University and the Richard Paul Richmond Center for Business Law and Public Policy, a joint venture of Columbia Law School and Columbia Business School. On behalf of the Columbia Centers and the experts here today, thank you for joining us. Today's topic is one of great importance to everyone. Oil availability and price goes to the core of our economy, environmental issues, world politics, and world security. The recent oil price drop surprised many and certainly is welcome to consumers. But where is this going? And what are the implications and opportunities? Today we'll explore many of these questions. We have two panels for you today. First, we will explore cheap oil and the prospects for energy innovation. David Schisser, Dean Emeritus at Columbia Law School, Harvey R. Miller Professor of Law and Economics, and co-director of the Richmond Center, will lead and moderate that panel. After a break, I'll be back with another great panel to discuss the oil price crash, the outlook for prices, U.S. production, and geopolitics. There will be Q&A opportunity today. Each panel will take questions from the floor. When we go to questions, please wait for the microphone to come to you and to make sure that everyone can hear the question. You have the backgrounds on of the speakers, so we will keep the introduction short today so we can focus on substantive topics. I would like to make one brief announcement before I turn it over to David. Michael Gretz had his book out for display today as a sample. If someone is taking a look at that, if you could return it to the desk on your way out, we would appreciate it. So let's get to it. Let me introduce David Schisser.
Jesse, thank you. And thank you all for being with us today. This should be a really interesting session. The energy landscape is changing all the time. It's changing in very important ways, and those changes have implications for the economy, for national security, and for the environment. Faculty at different schools within Columbia are working on these issues, so we have a panel composed of professors from the law school, SEPA, and the business school. And we're looking at a very broad topic to sort of lay the foundation for the discussion that will come about the oil market. And the very broad topic that this panel is considering are different ways that the government tries to change the mix of energy that we use. So our leadoff hitter is Michael Gratz, who is the Columbia Alumni Professor of Tax Law at the Law School. He's also the author of a wonderful and at the moment missing book called The End of Energy, which I do hope you'll read. It's quite terrific. Michael is going to start by giving us some background about the past 4 decades, including why the government is so focused on energy and what policy levers the government can use. Then we will turn to Jeff Heal, who is on my left, your right. Jeff is the Donald C. Waite Professor of Social Enterprise at the Business School, and he's going to talk about government efforts to promote renewable energy and the effect, if any, that cheap oil will have on those efforts. Then my turn will come next, and I'll speak about why government interventions in energy are so hard to get right, talk about some problems that have arisen with government subsidies and ways that we can do better. And then we will have our cleanup hitter, David Sandalow, who is, I'm a Mets fan, so for once I actually like baseball metaphors. It's not as painful as it used to be. Anyway, David is the inaugural fellow at the Center for Global Energy Policy at SEPA. And because we didn't want this panel to be only about the United States, David is going to talk about climate policy in China. So Michael, let's please begin with you.
Thank you, David. Yogi Berra famously said that predictions are difficult, especially about the future. I'm going to talk mostly about history, which I think you can get right. In spring of 2011, when Barack Obama made his major energy policy speech and produced a blueprint for energy, for a secure energy future, many newspapers ran a cartoon by Jeff Stoller depicting the 8 presidents before Obama, from Nixon to Obama, each saying, we must reduce our dependency on Mideast oil. A year earlier, Jon Stewart, who has replaced Walter Cronkite as the nation's voice of news, played clips from the same 8 presidents, all promising to end our dependence on oil, all offering energy alternatives, all setting deadlines for reaching their goals. The problem, of course, is that 4 decades of U.S. energy policy failures are hardly funny. For most of our nation's history, we've been able to garner all of the energy we need from our lands, first from wood, then from coal, and then from oil. From the end of World War II through the late 1960s, the U.S. had not only produced the vast bulk of oil consumed domestically, but also as an emergency supplier to the rest of the world. U.S. and British oil companies had long maintained control over the oil reserves of the Middle East. Before the 1970s, our nation's struggle had been how to manage abundance. Indeed, until the Arab embargo of October of 1973, which surprised our political leaders and stunned the American public, we had been remarkably complacent about our energy policy. Complacency had settled in largely because oil prices had been remarkably stable and in fact had not risen nearly as fast as inflation generally. U.S. oil was plentiful and cheap. The job of U.S. energy regulators until then was how to manage abundance. In effect, they limited output in order to manage supply and limited output to domestic consumption. In 1969, when he visited the United States to attend Dwight Eisenhower's funeral, the Shah of Iran offered to sell the U.S. 1 million barrels a day for a decade at $1 a barrel, an offer that Richard Nixon turned down with hardly any discussion. When King Faisal visited the U.S. in 1971, oil was not even discussed with Richard Nixon. The biggest policy of the U.S. to that point was an oil tariff, an oil quota that had been adopted by Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. So we used our oil when it was cheap, even when Mideast oil was much cheaper. But dramatic change was on the way, due principally to strong economic growth and rising income in the post-war era. Total world energy consumption more than tripled between 1949 and 1972. Worldwide oil demand quintupled over the next few years. So prices had remained remarkably stable because of the vast reserves in the Middle East. And our problems began with Muammar al-Gaddafi. At 27, he was a successful leader of a coup in Libya. He expelled all American and British troops. He then put the squeeze on Occidental Petroleum. Occidental turned to Exxon to try and supply the oil that they needed. Occidental was getting all of its oil from Libya. Exxon brushed him off and turned down Occidental. And as a result, Gaddafi basically tripled the price of oil during that period. His price demands were not sufficient. He also put an end to the 50-50 split that had existed between American and European oil companies and the Middle Eastern nations. And it was clear that at that point, control over Middle Eastern oil had irrevocably shifted to the governments rather than the oil-producing companies. Following Gaddafi's lead, Abu Dhabi, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia all sought higher prices for their oil. The OPEC countries all began demanding equity participation, and this was a turning point as the oil-producing nations established control over the oil in their lands. Richard Nixon, who was the first of the 8 presidents to confront our nation's new dependence on foreign oil, thought he had a solution, so he turned to 2 pillars of foreign policy. He turned to Iran, that stable and good friend of ours, and to Saudi Arabia. He thought they were the 2 pillars of oil stability. As everybody knows, the Iranian pillar collapsed soon thereafter, And even though Saudi Arabia has remained a U.S. Ally along with other nations in the Persian Gulf, it's they who have held the control in that relationship. The problem was not only that we had the wrong foreign policy, we also had the wrong domestic policies. When the embargo hit in the fall of 1973, both oil and natural gas prices were controlled. Natural gas had been controlled since the 1930s. Oil began to be controlled only in 1971 when Nixon issued his wage and price controls. He thought they would disappear within 90 days, but it was a decade later when the election of Ronald Reagan occurred before oil prices were decontrolled. The contradictions of our energy policy in the 1970s were apparent. Congress wanted to keep oil and gas prices low to benefit energy consumers to use less. But why would and then they urged citizens to use less, but why would a homeowner or business make large capital investments in energy conservation when natural gas and heating oil and gasoline were all cheap? Before Reagan, each of our presidents quested for a technological silver bullet to solve the problems of energy. Nixon, it was the nuclear breeder reactor. Jimmy Carter put his bets on synfuels. Both cost billions and both came to naught. In Congress, the search for technological solutions just became one more occasion for distributing largesse to constituents and contributors. Geographic goals dominated technological goals with the Congress. The R&D efforts of that period, with the possible exception of solar, were all failures. The essential point is that however you do subsidies for energy, you'll find wide variations in their amounts relative to the fossil fuel savings that they yield. So government subsidies have not been neutral across products or technologies. Ethanol subsidies and black liquor, I think, are the two worst cases, but one can find others. Importantly, imposing a tax on disfavored fuels does not create favorites among cleaner alternatives and is a better solution. But of course, anti-tax fervor has been the glue that has held the Republican coalition together since the 1970s, and it has been impossible to enact tax legislation on gasoline or fuel, with minor exceptions in 1990 and 1993. That left one other option, which is to limit consumption through regulation or mandates. And before the 1970s, as I said, the federal government played a very small part in regulating oil and gas and other energy. And during the 1970s, thousands of pages of regulation came into effect, including environmental regulations. Virtually all of them were of the command and control sort, where Congress and the regulators told you exactly what kind of technology to use, how much output you could have, and so forth. Interestingly, the CAFE fuel economy standards, which came into effect in 1975 and were deliberately ineffectual at the time, but have been tightened since, are a perfect example of where we failed to modernize our policies. They created incentives for the Japanese companies, who were very good at producing small cars, to produce larger cars like the Infiniti and the Lexus, and for U.S. companies who are very good at producing large cars to produce small cars, as we've seen. And unfortunately, however, you can't persuade Congress to create a cap-and-trade system for the CAFE standards, because cap-and-trade has become a dirty word. Sherlock Holmes told us to be aware of the dog that does not bark, and in energy policy, the dog that has not barked is tax policy. It has been true since we needed energy policy. Jimmy Carter's gasoline plan Bill Clinton's BTU tax have all failed. And price, of course, has played the central role during this entire period. Nothing that we did or might have done had the potential, I think, to make Americans pay the price for the energy they consume. But our history doesn't give us a great cause for optimism. And I have to say that understanding and knowing our past failures may not be enough to prevent us from repeating them. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. Jeff, let's turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So last year was an interesting year from the energy perspective at the global level. Last year, for the first time ever, the world built more renewable capacity than fossil fuel capacity. That's happened in the US for several years. It's happened in a number of European countries. But last year was the first time this happened globally. So why is that happening? Really it reflects the growth in the competitiveness, the cost competitiveness of renewable energy, and that's really been quite dramatic. And it's probably the biggest thing happening at the global energy scene. Let me give you some numbers. So, for example, here in the US, the cheapest way of producing electric power anywhere is by wind. If you're in the right location, right place, with the right sort of wind flows, you can get electricity out of wind for about 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour. That will be somewhere on the high plains or maybe in Hawaii. Solar power, you can generate electricity for about 6 cents a kilowatt hour, again, if you're in the right location, which is the Southwest, and if you've got utility scale operations, and scale matters there. Gas costs somewhere between 5 and 6 cents a kilowatt hour. So and that depends on the price of gas, obviously. Gas prices have been quite volatile. Currently, they're very low. So current gas prices, gas would cost about 5 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour. And new coal plants could produce power at about 7 cents a kilowatt hour. So you can see from that that, at least here in the US, renewable energy is competitive. It has some problem with intermittency, which I'll deal with in a second, but in general terms, it's cost competitive. And those prices I just gave you instantly, those are wholesale prices. So if you think about what you guys are paying as retail consumers, you're paying here in New York City, you're paying about 20 cents a kilowatt hour. The average retail price over the US as a whole is about 15 cents a kilowatt hour. What's interesting about that is that solar, which is at the top end of being competitive, the upper range of where it could possibly be competitive in the wholesale market, is highly competitive in the retail market. And that's one of the reasons we've seen a massive growth in off-grid solar power in the last couple of years. You can produce solar power on rooftops for 10, 12, 15 cents a kilowatt hour, and by comparison with the retail price of power, that's attractive. So you've seen an enormous growth in off-grid solar production. Companies like Solar City, Sun Edison, and so on, putting solar panels on roofs, big box stores, even individual homes. And that's economically attractive at current solar prices. There was an interesting article actually in the Financial Times just a couple of days ago pointing out that the town of Georgetown in Texas has decided it's going to get all of its power from wind and solar by 2017. Not as a result of any state-level mandates, because there's no state-level mandates about renewable power in Texas, but simply because those look to be the cheapest sources of power in Texas at the moment. Well, the prices I gave you just now are US prices. The price of renewable energy is much the same wherever you go in the world. The technology is essentially the same. The prices of fossil fuels, however, are higher in other countries than they are in the US. Gas in Europe is about 4 times gas in the US. Gas in Asia is about 5 to 6 times gas in the US. And oil, the Brent crude, is just a few dollars a barrel more expensive than the WTI. So in general, if renewables are competitive in the US, then they're certainly competitive in other countries because the bar is higher in terms of the prices of fossil fuels there. So we've got a situation where, for the first time ever, renewable energy looks as if it's beginning to take off just on the basis of its cost competitiveness. And there are gains to come. Wind is probably a mature technology at this point. We don't expect radical changes in the cost of wind power. But solar is not a mature technology. There are significant technological changes coming in the generation of solar photovoltaic. And so those could increase efficiency and reduce costs quite considerably. Okay, so What's the impact of all of this on fossil fuels? Many years back, I worked for OPEC. I was an advisor to the Secretary General of OPEC. And at the time I was working for OPEC, the Saudi oil minister was a very flamboyant, very colourful guy called Zaki Yamani. And he made a famous statement, which I think sticks in the memory of everybody who's in the oil business. He said that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones, and the oil age won't end because we run out of oil. It's a memorable statement. That was back in the early 70s, I guess, early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. We're beginning to see that happening today. We need to focus it. We need to talk about the impact of all this on fossil fuels. We need to unpack fossil fuels and stop treating them as an aggregate. Coal, oil, and gas are really all quite different here. The coal era is coming to an end right now. You know, coal has been a dominant fossil fuel for 200 years, but coal is being phased out. You know, 7 or 8 years ago, the US got 55% of its electricity from coal. Today, it's 38%. And that's before the Obama regulations kick in. That's just a result of market forces, the result of drop in power of wind, drop in the price of wind, and drop in the price of natural gas. Same thing is happening in other countries. Countries are switching away from coal, partly because of cost issues and partly because of pollution issues. China, for example, recently announced that it expects to reach maximum coal consumption in 3 years from now, and then start scaling down its consumption of coal. And that's primarily for reasons to do with domestic pollution. Domestic pollution is a kind of life or death issue for the leadership in China at this point. And a lot of the Chinese pollution comes from coal-fired power. So that's coal. I mean, coal, I think, is on the way out. We'll see coal consumption falling, and you can see that if you look at the price of the coal industry. If you look at the market capitalization of the US coal industry, it's fallen dramatically in the last couple of years. The stock market can read the writing on the wall as far as coal is concerned and see that dropping. Oil is different. Oil has a market niche, in which it's very competitive, which is transportation. It's difficult to envisage alternatives to oil in the transportation field, certainly in flying, for example. There's no immediate prospect of anything other than oil as a source of power in aircraft. And in ships also. I mean, there are electric vehicles, and they're sort of grappling with a very, very small piece of the market at this point. But again, there's issues in scaling that up on a large scale. So oil has a market niche which will be hard to push it out of. And then natural gas. Natural gas has been replacing coal as a preferred fossil fuel in many countries. It's cleaner. You know, there's much less pollution, much less in the sense of pollution that directly affects people's health. There's also much less in the way of greenhouse gas emissions from natural gas. So we're seeing a growth of natural gas. And natural gas actually is sort of in some ways complementary to solar and wind. If a utility has a large endowment of solar and wind, then it has to deal with the problem of intermittency. The sun doesn't always shine and so on. So most utilities that have large supplies of renewable energy also have large supplies of gas. And they use gas power stations as a way of backing up their intermittent renewable energy. And that's an important point to emphasize, that renewables go together with natural gas here in the US, for example. We've seen a growth in renewable energy and a growth in the use of natural gas, and those things are sort of symbiotic. If you've got a utility that's heavily dependent on renewables, it needs a lot of access to gas. Gas is about the only energy source you can turn up and down really quickly on the same kind of scale as the wind goes from weak to strong and vice versa. Now that's beginning to change, interestingly enough. One of the most interesting ventures with respect to the sort of long-term energy balances is the recent announcement by Elon Musk and SolarCity of the provision of storage batteries. The ideal way of dealing with intermittency from renewable energy is to store renewable energy. To store it when it's abundant and then play it back, so to speak, when there's a shortage. At the moment, we don't have particularly good technologies for storing energy. And that's the one, I guess, key missing link in terms of the large-scale deployment of renewable energy, the inability to store it. So we're using natural gas instead as effectively a substitute for storing renewable energy. In some regions, people use hydropower for this. For example, in Northern Europe, where renewable energy is used very widely, hydropower is used as a backup. Norway and Sweden have huge amounts of surplus hydropower. and that's fed into the German grid, for example, when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining, and it's taken out of the German grid when there's plenty of renewable power. So they use hydro there as a kind of balancing item. And hydro is a convenient way of storing energy, obviously. But here in the US, we have less capacity to use hydro as a balancing item in that sort of way. So what is really interesting is to see the possibility of large-scale battery storage as a possible way of overcoming the issue of intermittency with renewable power. And large-scale battery storage obviously is not only important in terms of its capacity to smooth the output of intermittent renewables, but it's also very important in the transportation context too. When I mentioned that oil has a kind of a firm hold on transportation at the moment, one thing that could break that hold is the availability of cheap, cost-effective batteries. At the moment, if you look at something like, for example, the Tesla Model S, an $80,000 car, the battery in that costs about $40,000. And most of the weight of the vehicle is the battery. If you look at something like a Renault Leaf, which is a $30,000 vehicle, the battery is $15,000 to $16,000. So the economics of batteries is very unattractive. It's making the cost of electric vehicles very high. So if Mr. Musk and people like him can bring down the cost of batteries significantly, they can do two things. They can make electric vehicles significantly more cost competitive and weaken the hold of oil on the transportation industry. And they can also provide a way of smoothing out the output from renewable energy and make it less important to use gas, make it more conceivable that we can move fully away from fossil fuels onto renewable fuels. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you. So I think you heard a bit of pessimism from Michael, a bit of optimism from Jeff, and I will maybe be a little bit closer to Michael than Jeff, but you can decide for yourself. Because my particular focus in the next few minutes is not necessarily on the changes that have happened in the energy market, which are quite exciting, but on the role of government subsidies in making them happen. And there I'm a bit pessimistic. It seems to me that we've had some challenges. I'm very sympathetic to the goals, but I think the implementation has been disappointing, and I'll mention two types of problems. The fact that we're pursuing competing goals and also some design flaws in the subsidies that we have, both for hydrocarbons and also for green energy. So to start with competing goals, we all know that there are huge economic advantages to technological developments in the energy area. But I want to focus also on two other important issues, national security and the environment. So we know that energy has important environmental implications. Hydrocarbons are the main source of greenhouse gas emissions, cause of climate change. There's also pollution. I think that's all familiar. National security is also something that we hear a lot about when people talk about energy, and I do think that there are important implications there too. I'll mention two that I think particularly stand out. The first is the possibility that the U.S. has to spend additional money in our defense, in our defense budget, in order to police access to petroleum in particular. We spend about $80 billion a year on our naval presence in the Persian Gulf. I'm sure we'd spend a significant amount of money, but it might be that it would be less than $80 billion if not for the world's reliance on the oil resources that are there. And the second point is that some energy producers are geopolitical rivals, Russia, Iran, other places. And so when the world buys oil and when oil is expensive, those countries have more resources to do things that at least sometimes the United States doesn't particularly want them to do. So the question then is there tension between our environmental and our national security goals? And there's good news and bad news. So to start with the good news, one way that we can pursue both goals is greater energy efficiency. If we use less oil, for example, that puts downward pressure on price. It also means that energy shocks, if energy suddenly becomes less available, if the oil is harder to get, has less impact on us. So reducing demand actually is a strategy that's good for national security and also for the environment, because less use means fewer greenhouse gas emissions, less pollution. But there's also bad news, because another way to pursue those national security goals is with broader and more diverse supply. If we find oil in the United States, the shale revolution, if Brazil finds more oil offshore, if Mexican reserves start to become more productive, that's also good for national security, because again, you have more slack in supply, energy shocks are less important, it puts downward pressure on price, certainly something we've seen a great deal of the last few months. And so that means less revenue for geopolitical rivals and perhaps less pressure on the United States to worry quite so much about access to the Gulf. But at the same time, more supply also means more consumption, more possibilities of pollution, water contamination, greenhouse gas emissions. So there's certainly a tension there. And the truth is some of our subsidies encourage greater production, and at the same time we have environmental policies working in the other way. So you have situations like the Keystone Pipeline, question of whether to drill in Alaska, whether fracking is a good idea or not. And so you see environmentalists and people who care about national security on different sides of those issues. So I think to some extent the challenge the government faces is pursuing competing goals. But let's turn away from oil for a second, because I think oil is the place where we see it, and then the picture is easier. If we think about natural gas, you could have had issues like that. About 10 years ago, U.S. natural gas reserves were dwindling. The country was preparing to become a major importer of natural gas, and at the time the major exporters were Russia, Iran, and Qatar. So you could have seen a similar dynamic, but of course with the shale revolution, massive new reserves of natural gas in the United States that are accessible. Latest forecast from the Energy Information Administration suggests 110 years of supply, so you really don't have those issues in the same way. And so I'll just make then two, I think, somewhat provocative points about national security and other types of energy. So the first is coal. One often hears from the coal industry, for example, that there are important national security reasons to keep using coal, and I just don't think that's true anymore. I think now that we have ample supplies domestically of natural gas, coal is less important as a national security matter. We really don't need it in the same way. And the second point I'll make, just to be sure that I aggravate both sides equally, I would say the same about renewables. There is a very good environmental case for renewables, but I don't see the national security case for it, at least until we get to the point where it starts to displace petroleum with transportation. And electric vehicles might get us there at some point, but we aren't there now. In any event, competing goals complicates what the government tries to do, but I'll turn now to the other set of points I wanted to make, which is just about flawed design, problems with these subsidies. And I'll give you 4 examples. The first is rebound, a concept that may be familiar to many of you, but for those who haven't heard about it, it's important. So imagine that our goal is to try to get consumers to use less gasoline. One option, a very straightforward option, is to increase our gasoline tax, and then you're using price. People are less likely to use gasoline. Another option, which is actually one thing we do, is a tax credit for hybrid vehicles. And there the idea is you're creating an incentive to use the technology which ought to be more fuel efficient. But there's a problem, and the problem with the hybrid credit is that because you're getting better mileage, every mile that you drive becomes cheaper. And when you reduce the cost of driving an extra mile, people are rational. They tend to drive more. And this is a more general issue about encouraging, with subsidies, encouraging energy efficiency, because you give up some of the benefit that you otherwise would have get. It rebounds, because you also encourage people to use, get an energy efficient air conditioner, you might cool the room to a lower temperature. It's the same point. So that's rebound. How could we do better? One point is that taxes don't have that effect. Remember the gas tax, if it's more expensive to drive the extra mile, you're less likely to do it. But if we need to use subsidies, and for political reasons we seem to like subsidies, then what we need to do is to have a closer connection between what we're actually trying to achieve and the behavior that the policy rewards. So in this particular case, it's not only that we want energy efficiency, we also want people to drive less. You could imagine adding a condition to the hybrid credit, saying people can only claim it if they get mileage-based auto insurance, which is basically a way insurance companies raise your premiums if you drive more. So let's turn to a second design flaw, because we talked about a perverse effect on demand. What about supply? Well, one of the key ways the US government supports wind and solar and other renewables is by giving a 2.3 cent per kilowatt hour credit. But the credit is based on something very specific. It's the amount of energy that's produced. And subsidizing production turns out not to be the best idea, because what you're doing is sometimes encouraging people to create energy, generate energy that isn't needed. So wind is particularly easy to generate at night, but the demand for electricity is far less significant at night. And as Jeff mentioned, at least today, we don't have significant capacity to store energy. So what ends up happening is some companies run their wind turbines at night in order to collect these 2.3 cents per kilowatt hour, and we get a phenomenon called negative pricing, which basically means that the companies have to pay consumers to take this electricity. That's a sign that this is energy that's not as useful as energy that could otherwise be produced. It's not replacing, say, energy generated by coal, which is the real point of this subsidy. A third problem, which Michael mentioned, so I won't get into it more, is just to say that subsidies tend to require the government to choose what technology to subsidize, and the government does not have a particularly good track record in doing that. One of my favorite examples, not because it's all that informative, but because it's entertaining, is a company called Fisker Automotive. Anybody heard of Fisker? Okay, good. Some of you have now. Who's heard of Justin Bieber? I actually didn't know who he was until my children told me. But the good news about Fisker Automotive, which makes luxury electric vehicles, is that Bieber got one for his 18th birthday. But the bad news is that Consumer Reports rated their $100,000 vehicle as the worst luxury sedan on the market, and that's partly because it broke down several times on the track when they were testing it. But the US government did provide about $350 million of subsidies to Fisker Automotive, so not our strong suit. We're better off, if we're going to do subsidies, doing them broadly, trying not to pick the technology. So one example would be, instead of singling out a particular type of fuel-efficient car, you could give a credit just for fuel efficiency, a certain amount of money for every mile per gallon above a minimum level. Last one I'll mention is that we also have a tendency to pay people for things they would do anyway, which is not a particularly good use of the government's money. So one example is we sometimes subsidize things that we're also requiring by law. There was a mandate to use a certain amount of ethanol in gasoline, and for many years Congress was also subsidizing it. Congress spent about $10 billion on this subsidy until the subsidy was finally allowed to expire in December of 2011. But if people had to use it anyway, why would we subsidize it? So my point is these are important goals to pursue. It would be better, though, to try to think through carefully what the effects of these policies are and to use ones that are cost-effective and get us where we want to be. And with that, I think we'll shift gear and talk a bit about China. David, thank you.
Thank you, David. So my assignment is to talk about China and climate change. I'm going to start by just talking about China and oil demand for a moment in light of the overall topic of today's session, and my colleagues from the Center on Global Energy Policy in the next session may want to comment on whether they agree with what I'm saying or not. But the American hydrocarbon revolution has received a lot of attention for its role in the oil price decline of the past year, and rightly so. I think one factor that has perhaps not received as much attention as it merits is the decline in Chinese oil demand, although you see this often mentioned, but it's just worth putting some numbers around it. In 2004 in China, the increase in oil demand was about 17% year over year in the peak year, and that prompted a lot of commentary about a demand shock in the oil markets. And in the 70s, we had seen a supply shock leading to a large increase in oil prices. In the mid part of the last decade, we saw a demand shock. So last year, Chinese oil demand increased by roughly 2.5%, so significantly down. And China's ability to continue to soak up global crude supplies will clearly not be what it was in the past decade. That's as a result of a couple of factors. First, Chinese economy is slowing. Any conference I've been in China in the past 6 or 9 months, the words new normal are what you hear all the time, and that's the new normal in terms of economic growth. So significant slowdown in Chinese economic growth. And then in addition to that, GDP growth and oil demand are now decoupled in the Chinese economy in a way that we hadn't seen previously, or at least oil demand is growing more slowly than GDP growth, partly as a result of structural changes in the economy. It's important to say Chinese oil statistics can be challenging. There are challenges with knowing how much it goes into strategic stocks in China, so it can be difficult to read. But there's no question that what's happening in the Chinese oil markets is playing a role in the overall decline in oil prices, and that's something to pay attention to. So let me shift to climate change, which relates to the clean energy themes that you've heard from the last 3 panelists. And recall a dinner I it was about 2 years ago in Beijing, on a cold winter day in Beijing. I was at a restaurant and talking to a waitress there who, I told her I was going down to Hainan Island, which is a beautiful tropical island in the south part of China. It's a very cold winter day. And she looked at me and said, "Oh, you're so lucky." And then continued to say, "There's no PM 2.5 in Hainan Island." She was not focused on the warmth. She was focused on the lack of air pollution. And that was striking to me, but it was also striking to me just to recognize how easily PM 2.5 rolled off her lips. And just out of curiosity, how many people in the audience feel confident they know what PM 2.5 is? Okay, so I think every waitress in China has high familiarity with the concept. PM 2.5 it stands for particulate matter 2.5. It's particulate matter of 2.5 microns or less. It's the standard air pollution measure that's used both in China and around the world. With an app on my phone, I could tell you what the PM 2.5 readings are in Beijing and every other major Chinese city today. People in China routinely go to these apps in order to understand the air pollution levels. And the reason that's important for climate change is that there's a high alignment between the government's climate change goals and the Chinese and the government's local air pollution goals. Let me just make three general points about Chinese climate policy. The first is that China has, well, let me start with some basics. I mean, China is the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world by a pretty significant measure. It's 20 or 25% over the United States now and growing. In fact, carbon dioxide, the most important greenhouse gas, stays in the atmosphere for 100 years. And for a long time in the discussion between developed and developing countries on this issue, developing countries have made the point that the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions from the United States exceed those of other countries. Within a couple of decades, cumulative emissions from China will exceed cumulative emissions from the United States. China is a very significant contributor to global warming, and there certainly is no solution to the global warming problem that doesn't centrally involve reducing Chinese greenhouse gas emissions. So, but point number one, China has some serious global warming goals. In a very high-profile way, in last November, President Xi Jinping of China and President Obama announced a quite historic agreement on part of both their countries to reduce greenhouse gases. The Chinese commitment was to peak their emissions of greenhouse gases around 2030 and to contribute, and for 20% of their energy to be from non-fossil sources by the year around 2030. Those were, in the views of most analysts, a departure from what was from business as usual. I think most analysts had seen 2040 and that era as being more likely to be the peak year. And the 20% non-fossil is a pretty significant goal on the part of China. Actually, you see some commentators who say that China's total installed capacity by 2030 is going to be in the area of 4,000 to 5,000 gigawatts, which may be optimistic. But if that's true, then the non-fossil portion of China's energy mix in 2030, pursuant to that goal, will be as big as all energy generation in the United States today. So it's a very significant number. It's also, I think, interesting to note that this was done in the context of international discussion with the United States, which is not something the Chinese had, the type of announcement the Chinese had been interested to do in the past. But finally, it's important to note, although this is a serious commitment on the part of the Chinese, it is by no means enough in order to address our global warming problems. The cumulative announcements to date from the United States, from China, from all other countries will not get us to a level that avoids dangerous human interference with the climate system. But the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and it's clearly a move in the right direction. So first, China has some serious climate goals. Second, those goals align with broader policy objectives on the part of the Chinese. First, most obviously, environmental objectives, as I referred to earlier. Most steps that you can take to address global warming pollution in China and indeed around the world align with steps that can be taken to address local air pollution. The biggest causes of local air pollution in China are inefficient coal-fired power plants, including home heating from coal, vehicle emissions, and if you reduce those and improve energy efficiency, you address global warming. There are a few technological areas where there's a divergence and where you could improve local air pollution, yet go in the wrong way on global warming. Those don't seem to be the focus of much Chinese investment at this point. There's also alignment between the global warming goals and economic goals. Address global warming by improving energy efficiency, improve economic performance by improving energy efficiency. Same for security objectives and also, interestingly, I think for diplomatic objectives. I was a climate negotiator some in the 90s, and I was regularly berated by small island states as a U.S. Climate negotiator for the U.S. culpability in the slow disappearance of their islands. And I will never forget the first conversation I had with a president of a small island state at the 2009 Copenhagen conference, whose ire was entirely directed at China. It was not directed at the United States. And I think Chinese are experiencing this type of pushback and anger from some developing countries because of their greenhouse gas emissions, and as part of broader Chinese diplomatic objectives, I think there's an interest in being perceived as responsible stakeholders in the global system, taking on the global warming issue. So third, a third and final point, and I can elaborate on this. China has a very significant policy architecture to address global warming today, and it's growing across a range of different areas. But most notably, China has a significant move towards emissions trading programs. China has, a couple of years ago, started pilot emissions trading programs for greenhouse gases in 7 different provinces with population between 250 and 300 million people. There's been a lot of effort in these provinces to build up the somewhat complicated administrative architecture behind emissions trading programs, and a lot of work is going into this. As with most emissions trading programs in the world, there have been challenges, but the NDRC, when the lead Chinese agent central government along with the State Council, has now announced that China will move towards a national emissions trading program for greenhouse gases. So a very significant set of developments from that standpoint. China also has significant policies on coal and reducing coal consumption. Actually, last year, for the first time, Chinese coal consumption declined year over year. And China has announced that 2020 will be the year of peak coal in China. And I've talked to analysts in China in the past couple of months who say they think that's going to come sooner. In fact, there's perhaps a minority, but some analysts who say that we've already reached peak coal in China, and that it will go to year-to-year decline next year. And I think the reasons for that include the slowdown in economic growth, the change in the composition of growth in China, moving more from manufacturing to the service sector, and then just improved Chinese energy efficiency overall. So the policy architecture includes emissions trading, includes coal policies, very significant policies to promote renewables, and Jeff has already referred to some of this, but China is deploying more solar than anybody else in the world today. It has very aggressive goals for solar deployment. Last year deployed 10 gigawatts of new solar capacity, and has goals to significantly increase that. Nuclear power is important in China today. Half of the world's nuclear plants under construction today are in China. And there are several dozen Chinese plants under construction with plans to increase that. Each one of those plants displaces a huge amount of carbon dioxide that might come from coal. Efforts to increase natural gas. China uses 4% of Chinese energy comes from natural gas, which is significantly below the global average of around 20%. And China has considerable ambitious goals to increase domestic natural gas consumption. China has the largest shale reserves in the world, or the largest shale resource in the world, but so far has tapped only a very small percentage of it. There's some ambitious Chinese goals to try to tap more of that. And then China has very aggressive energy efficiency goals. I've referred to this already, but each 5-year plan in the Chinese system has ratcheted up, has continued to strengthen energy efficiency goals. So I'm going to, let me just close by recalling my first trip to China, where I was, summer of 1981. I spent a summer in China, and that summer, there was exactly one international telephone line in the entire city of Shanghai that we could use to call home. We would take a cab to the Heping Hotel every weekend to call home. now when I fly to China, which I do every couple of months, by the time, as soon as I hit the tarmac after a 14-hour nonstop flight, of course, the first thing I do and everybody else on the plane does is pull out their phone. And by the time I hit the tarmac, I may well have sent a half a dozen messages around the world before I even get there. And if you had told me as a young adult when I was going to China that I would be pulling something like this out of my pocket and sending messages around the world before I even hit the tarmac, I would have said you were crazy. And for those who are pessimistic about our prospects of addressing climate change, and particularly China's ability to do that, I think we have an existence proof of dramatic technological change, its ability to change the world. I think it could happen on this issue too.
David, thank you. I have many questions for the panel, but I actually want to give all of you priority first. So I'm happy to take questions from you. Jason, why don't you kick us off?
Do we need a microphone?
Yes.
I think we do need a microphone, so if we can.
It's coming.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Thanks. That was great. Thanks for this presentation. It's Jason Bordoff, Director of the Center on Global Energy Policy. So I'm confused after listening to all of you because Michael Greitz said we have a big problem because we don't have an energy policy and we're not internalizing social costs through a carbon tax. And Jeff said we don't need to because the cost of renewables is now cheaper than the cost of fossil fuels, so we're going to make a transition to a low-carbon economy absent policy that internalizes social costs. So I want to kind of come down on the side of pessimists and kind of try to ring an alarm bell really loudly and say, and I'm looking at the data, but I'm curious to hear why I'm wrong. We are nowhere close to being at a point where hydrocarbon demand and coal demand starts to decline globally. Just last year, hydrocarbons were 87% of the global energy mix, and 20 years ago, hydrocarbons were 87% of the global energy mix. That hasn't changed at all. We've seen, as a percentage basis, rapid growth in renewables, but we've also seen growth in hydrocarbons as well. Coal use globally last year increased 2.5 times as fast as renewables did. It's great that we added more renewable capacity, but I think that Bloomberg New Energy Finance kind of headline got badly distorted as kind of saying we're reached a turning point where we've solved this problem, and obviously the question is not capacity addition, but use of different forms of fuel and how they compete in the global energy mix. Coal use last year was up 20% over 2009, up about 70% over the year 2000. Hasn't really declined much in the US. We had a period of time where it went down when gas prices reached their nadir, but it's actually kind of come back a little bit now. And obviously it'll have an impact if the Clean Power Plant rule goes into effect, but even that'll get it maybe from 40 to 30% of the US energy mix. And when I look out at China and India and the ASEAN countries and other things, we see dramatic increase in coal use. So in my view, if we care about doing something about climate change, which I do, I think policy is incredibly important. And I just don't, I want to weigh in on the side of saying like, renewables are not globally yet in most places. The idea that coal is on its way out, I think, is a dramatic overstatement relative to the way I see the data, but if I'm wrong, I want to understand why.
Jeff, did you want to start?
Sure. So what I think is interesting is that in spite of the fact that we aren't internalizing external costs, we're still making significant progress with renewables. From an economic perspective, we're obviously not making enough progress. We know that to make enough progress, we would need to internalize external costs and put a significant tax on fossil fuels. So while we're making progress in the right direction, we're not making progress fast enough from an economic perspective, and that's the cost of not internalizing those external costs. What I think is actually quite surprising, though, is the fact that we are making progress in spite of the fact that our policies are so weak and we don't have carbon taxes. And I guess in the US, one of the big things that's driving policy is actually the state-level policies as opposed to the federal-level policies. It's easy to forget state policies, but we've got 30 states with quite significant renewable portfolio standards, which are having significant incentives on the deployment of renewables in the US. So although there's no federal, well, there's the federal ITC and PTC, but the real, I think, push comes at the state level in the US. I'm more optimistic than you are about coal. I think I see, as David was mentioning, I see coal production dropping in China, I see coal use dropping in China, dropping in the US, dropping in Europe, and probably dropping even in India. You know, I mean, there's been a lot of, there's been a lot of, I'm sure you're more aware of this than I am. There's been a lot of political discussion of the role of coal in India in the last year or so, and it's a point of friction between the US and the Indian governments. But I mean, the indications are that in the last few months, even the Indian government is coming to recognise that the social costs of coal consumption in India are just very, very high. Pollution in Beijing, pollution in Delhi is now worse than Beijing. The PM 2.5 is worse there than it is in China. And you know, that will take a very high political toll in India eventually. I certainly, you know, I'm not implying we don't need policy. I would love to see a carbon tax. I'd love to see a $50 a tonne CO2 carbon tax, without any doubt. What is interesting is that the economic case for renewables is sufficiently compelling that even without a carbon tax, we're making some progress in the right direction, but not enough progress, and that I totally agree with.
So we'll go this way and we'll each say something. David.
I agree with what Jeff just said, and I agree with Jason that we absolutely need policy in order to address this issue, that we're not at a point yet where renewables will grow sufficiently to address our climate objectives without policy. Of course, they are competing against an incumbent industry that has benefited from policy support for much of a century. So the one policy that I don't think has been mentioned yet that's important is reducing fossil fuel subsidies. Yeah. And there are $400 billion of fossil fuel subsidies globally. And reducing those it would have a huge impact in addressing this problem. I also want to, I don't know if this is in order, David, but I want to use the opportunity of having the microphone to challenge a point you made. Since we're friends, I figured I could do it.
Definitely.
And in particular, your Fisker example. And you cite Fisker Automotive and the failure of Fisker Automotive as an example of government's inability well, I don't know how you put it, but that government's policy is not wise in this area. And my question would be, if a private bank loses money investing in a company, would you similarly say that that's an example of the private sector failing? The kind of rhetorical purpose of the question is clear, but the argument I guess I'd like to advance is that these government programs, such as the one that invested in Fisker, are specifically designed to take risk. And if we never had a failure in these government programs, that would be an example that the government was unwisely investing in not sufficiently risky to advance the objectives that Congress suggested in passing the legislation. And the question is, do you agree with that?
So I'll jump in just to answer that and to say it would certainly be unreasonable to test a policy by saying if we can identify risks that didn't go well, it must be a flawed policy. So I agree with that in the same way that when venture capitalists have a portfolio of technologies that they're betting on, they're pretty comfortable when they hit a couple of home runs and they have lots of strikeouts. And so all of that makes sense. I think, though, that what we would need to do, and it's a longer conversation than we have time for right now, but I'll just sketch the broad outlines of it. What you'd want is to be able to identify where the home runs are, too. And my sense is that there's just a real challenge when the government has to get very specific about choosing technologies, partly because the people making these judgments, quite understandably, don't necessarily have the expertise, but also because politics looms so large here, so that there are all kinds of constraints that operate. And so as a result, what you get is actually quite a track record of different failures. Michael mentioned breeder reactors and synfuels. There are sort of little nuggets in his book, for example, about the fact that the synfuels program might have had a better chance if there had been a decision to use Western coal, but the relevant committee chairs were from West Virginia and Pennsylvania and other eastern states. The coal unions cared a lot, and they tended to be stronger in the east, and so the bet was really placed on eastern coal. And in any event, I think the challenge we face is that venture capitalists are fairly single-minded about trying to find a technology that's most promising in a way that the government isn't is able to do. So this is why I'm more of a fan of broader efforts, or even one of the great things about a tax, a carbon tax, a gasoline tax, is it takes the government out of the business of trying to identify that promising thing that they're sure is going to work, and instead just creates a level playing field. As long as you can isolate all the different sources of whether it's carbon or gasoline then you're creating an incentive for different people to try different things to compete. And again, it's not the failure per se that troubles me. It's my own personal lack of confidence that the government has the institutional capacity to be the most effective vehicle for making these choices.
Let me just make a couple of quick comments on Jason's question. You know, there are many other failures other than Fisker. I have my own set of examples. I just want to emphasize 2 points. One is what Jeff said about the transportation sector. That is, we don't have a policy to deal with the costs of emissions and so forth in the transportation sector, and we should. We came very close in 1990. I was involved in the budget negotiation of the 90 Act. We came very close to getting a tax on all petroleum fuels, but at the last minute it dropped out, and we ended up with a nickel on the gas tax. And then I won a big bet with Alan Blinder that Clinton would get only a nickel on the gas tax. I think he got 4.3 cents or something. But the right policy, I think, is to impose a tax on either gasoline or petroleum fuels on the one hand or carbon on the other, and use the money to reduce the payroll tax so that you're taxing what you don't want more of and giving the money back in the form that you want, which is, you know, to lower the cost of labor. It seems to me this is really a straightforward policy that satisfies the no new taxes pledge in the sense that you don't have to raise taxes. There are some people talking about this in Congress. What is stunning to me, and I'll just give you one example, is that when Arnold Schwarzenegger wanted to raise the gasoline tax in California, the environmentalists told him that he would not get their support. And they told him that he would not get their support because they didn't want to take the rap for increasing gasoline taxes and get a backlash on the environmental movement. The environmentalists also, you know, concluded that taxes were off the table in 2010 and insisted on this strange coalition that failed to get cap and trade, which was accompanied by huge subsidies to the coal industry. There are failures on both the left and the right on these policy issues, and it seems to me that the question is how to build the right coalition for the right policy. And I think the only way to do that is not to think about these taxes as raising revenues, but rather to think about them as energy and environmental policy, and try and build a coalition that way. There are some new bills in Congress relating to carbon taxes, cap and dividend, tax and dividend kinds of legislation, and there is talk about carbon taxes now going back in Congress. So that's the highest note of optimism I can reach at the moment.
Yes.
I'd just like to make 3 points, most of which are questions. Number one, I got an email from Fisker yesterday telling me they're back in business. I'm sure that has nothing to do with the subsidy. Number two, with respect to a tax on gas, I'm not sure we in Connecticut drive any less than people in New Jersey, and we probably pay $1 to $1.50 per gallon more. I'm not sure that gas is elastic, at least in terms of the kind of taxes that are reasonable to be levied, but I'd be interested on your views on that. And third, it seems to me that the development of the new generation of solar panels is a highly important development, which seems to be mired somewhere in techno heaven. And we are producing something like 20% efficiency with respect to solar panels, and I understand there's technology to get us closer to 40. And I was just wondering if the panel could talk a bit about what's going on there.
There's a lot there. Maybe I'll just take a quick stab at the elasticity point. Do gas taxes make a difference in terms of behavior? So we should distinguish between the short run and the long run. Because in the short run, you live where you live, you have the cars that you have, and the commute that you have, and so on. And there are still changes that people make. At the margin, they'll drive less when they can. But certainly in the long run, in terms of the kind of car that you drive, in terms of where you choose to live, and in a whole other host of ways, I think there's a lot of evidence that it does make a difference. And one thought that I think both Michael and I had in listening to your question is comparing Europe with the United States. Europe has had much higher gasoline taxes for a long time, more significant investments in mass transit, just real smaller cars, real differences. So I think it does affect behavior, and I think it affects behavior in ways that are pretty efficient because each individual can think about how she or he can minimize their costs and therefore their emissions and their use in ways that's least costly to them. But there were a lot of other things you asked about too, so I'll turn it over to others to weigh in. So Jeff, you want to say something about new solar panels, for example?
Yeah, there's, as I said in my session, there is certainly, the wind technology is fairly mature, but solar isn't, and there is a lot of progress in the solar field to come, I think. I'm not a technologist. I get my information from people in the engineering department at Columbia. There's quite a big group of people, engineers at Columbia, who work on solar PV. And they say what you were just saying, which is that there's a potential to increase the efficiency of solar panels from around about 18 to 21% to somewhere around about 40% over the next decade, using different design, different materials, and also using concentrating solar PV as opposed to regular solar PV. So there's significant scope for improvement there. What is interesting, though, if you look at the total cost of solar power these days, more than half the total cost of a solar installation is now what's called the balance of system. So there's two pieces to the cost of a solar installation. One is the actual panels themselves. And a story I like to tell is that I've been teaching a course on sort of energy issues in the business school for 8 years now. When I started teaching the course, the panels cost $8 a watt. Today they cost 80 cents a watt. Just a dramatic change in the price over that relatively short period of time. So anyway, the cost of the panels has come down to the point where the cost of the panel is now a minority of the total cost of a solar installation. Most of the cost of a solar installation today is the frame that you put the panel on, the tracking device that makes it track the sun, and the inverter that converts DC to AC. And these so-called balance of system costs in the US are currently twice what they are in Germany. So you can get a system installed, for half in Germany what it costs to have the same system put up here. So the Germans have been doing it for longer, and there's obviously some learning that's been done there. So there's some hope that not only the cost of the panels themselves will come down, but the cost of these balance of system part of the total equation will come down significantly too over the next few years.
Let me just add that there is a real estate. There's a real real estate component to our existing solar panels. So a solar panel that is this big uses a certain amount of real estate to produce X amount of energy, and if you can get the solar panel to produce the same amount of energy but it's only this big, then you use half as much real estate, and so these giant roofs produce twice as much energy. So that's not without cost or limitation, the real estate component of it.
Yeah, so the improving efficiency will do exactly that, of course. Yeah.
The big transformation, of course, in solar is that during the 70s, when solar was really being pushed, Barry Commoner and others, wanted a solar panel on each lamp post, and it was home by home and lamp post by lamp post. And now you see it located at the utilities, and that's going to make a huge difference in this. But the subsidies, this goes back to David's point, but the subsidies, for example, in Connecticut, the state you just mentioned, are for homeowners to install panels on their roofs and so forth. And all of the subsidies in the 70s amounted to people basically installing home by home solar panels for hot water heat, and that was all there was. And so it's another example where the subsidies were misdirected.
there's a positive feedback loop here too. I mean, we have a fairly defined cost experience curve for solar, and as costs come down, deployment's going to increase, and that's going to further drive down costs. And then in addition, I think there's potential breakthrough innovations that would move us to a different cost curve, and there's research happening on that. One example on your real estate point, I talked to a company recently that's trying to sell a technology where they put little solar strips in windows so thin that you can see through the window, which would dramatically increase the potential for solar panels, obviously, in urban settings like Manhattan. Just one other point on elasticity. The inelasticity of demand for oil in the transportation sector is driven by the fact that there are no alternatives for oil in the transportation sector. And that's basic Econ 101, right? If you hypothetically imagine a world which we are very, very far away from being in which the vehicle stock was made up of vehicles that could use either oil or electricity or potentially some natural gas-based fuel, the elasticity of petroleum products would be very different than it is today.
Yes, please.
Two things. We've discussed batteries in terms of the improvement of technology. Also, we're dealing with fuel cells. There's a competing technology, Toyota, but also fusion, a dramatic change in fusion. My concern on the climate change situation is something we haven't discussed at all. And that is we get global warming. The permafrost in eastern Siberia has the possibility of diminishing significantly to the point where it's very toxic methane gas is released. And I think we perhaps in the whole context of pollution and risk to the human population generally, we should say something about how close are we to that release of that highly toxic methane gas.
Happy to. I'm not closely familiar with the latest literature. I know that scientists are, leading climate scientists are very, very worried about the phenomenon that you're discussing, and that if we get to some point where we start to have breakthrough melting of the permafrost, there could be very significant methane emissions, and that would be a difficult cycle to break.
One of the challenges is that there's so much uncertainty about exactly, there's uncertainty at a more basic level. So how much does a particular activity emit? So natural gas is a great example, because we know, for example, that the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions are down, 7–8% in the last dozen years. Half of that is because of changes in the economy, the economic slowdown, and other structural shifts. But half is about substituting natural gas for coal, which we have done. We were generating about half of our electricity from coal maybe a dozen years ago. We were down to the high 30s. I think we're in the low 40s now, but it's still been a major change. But there's actually quite a vibrant debate just about how much better, if at all, natural gas is than coal. We know that when you burn coal, it'll produce 2 to 3 times as much CO2 as burning natural gas, 2 to 3 times depending on the type of coal. But then on the other side of the coin, when you mine for natural gas, when you transport it, even when you use it, some of the methane is released in the atmosphere. That in and of itself is a source of, it's a greenhouse gas. And there's quite a debate about how much methane gets released, the so-called fugitive emissions question. So even just at that very basic level, there's not a consensus about how much is being emitted from a given activity. Then you have to say, okay, so assuming we knew that, what would be the effects on temperature over time? There are different models, different assumptions, and the scenario that you described is one of the scariest, but there are other scenarios where it's less of a problem, and then we get to the question, so for a given increase in temperature, what will the changes in the world be? And some of them could be really quite catastrophic. Strangely, some of them actually are positive at a local level, longer growing seasons up north. So there's just an awful lot of uncertainty. And to my mind, you have to do the best you can to project, and then we don't have the luxury of sort of waiting until we're certain. It doesn't work that way. But I just think one of the things that's difficult here is that we don't have a perfect way of predicting what will happen. Yes.
Thank you. Like Mr. Sandalo, I was surprised that fossil fuel subsidies were not mentioned in the first round of presentations. And I remain surprised that the idea of reducing them has been given fairly short shrift in the conversation that's been going on.
So everybody's for it.
Well,
I mean, the reason it's given short shrift is we all agree with that.
my question is, how could we accomplish it?
Just a few thoughts on that. So first, in the past 6 months to a year, we've seen the most significant drop in fossil fuel subsidies globally, I believe ever. And the drop in oil prices has made it politically easier to reduce fossil fuel subsidies in many countries. So across South Asia in particular, and in some of Indochina, we've seen some significant reductions in fossil fuel subsidies. It is also the case that President Obama has proposed eliminating fossil fuel subsidies in the United States, about $4 to $5 billion worth of fossil fuel subsidies, I believe, every year since he came to office. But Congress has yet to enact those proposals.
Just say a word about that, because there are different types. One type, which fortunately has been cut significantly, there are subsidies to keep the price low for consumers. And there are certainly well-intentioned reasons why people want to do that, because they think about poor people and their energy bills. I think there are much better ways to help people in that position, cash that's not targeted, say, for that particular use. But it exists in the world. It is, it is fortunately being phased out in some places, and that's good. The U.S. first implemented producer-level subsidies for hydrocarbons over 100 years ago. And there is a certain stickiness about subsidies. Once industries have them, they don't particularly want to keep them. The good news is that they haven't been increasing. I mean, we've seen very significant increases in green energy subsidies, but the hydrocarbon subsidies have not been increasing. Some of them are subject to price level triggers, so that some of them phased out, though many of them haven't. And I do think it would be good policy to get rid of those. But the politics are complicated for all the obvious reasons. Yes?
Yeah, with oil prices so cheap, how do you see that impacting the oil industry and the output of how will this affect this whole list that we're talking about?
So the question is, how will cheap oil prices affect the oil industry generally? And we are fortunate to have a whole panel that is about to come up in just a second to talk about it. But because this is our last chance to weigh in, we should all have our say about it too. Look, it's a fascinating time of turmoil in the industry. I personally think that the key driver of innovation for oil was high prices that people expected would stay around for a long time. So people took risks and figured out how to get oil from shale in ways that hadn't been possible before. And then the billion-dollar question, I guess, is at what level do prices have to fall in order for this activity to become uneconomic, and how long does it have to stay there? One of the things I find so interesting about shale, so if you're interested in offshore drilling, you know that there are possibilities out there, and you have to start today in order to get the stuff at the earliest in 5 years, or maybe 10. It's just a much longer window. One of the things that's unique about shale is you can ramp it up and ramp it down more quickly, which means you can have people exiting for a while, supply starts to contract, prices come up, and they come back in, which does suggest that there are limits to how high the price is likely to come, but that it could come up a lot. I'm happy that we'll have some experts who are going to give us some more context in a few minutes. But before then, anybody else want to weigh in?
Well, one of the sectors which is obviously very vulnerable is the Canadian heavy crude, the tar sands in Alberta. Those seem to need $70 or $80 a barrel to be profitable, and they're not getting that obviously at the moment. So then the Venezuelans obviously also have a lot of very heavy crude, all of which is going to be affected by this. I think the other big effect this has had on the oil industry is to make it appear much more risky than it was before. I mean, oil looked like a one-way bet, prices high and possibly rising. A lot of people are now saying is it's actually a risky business. Or it has been historically, of course. There's nothing terribly surprising about that, but I think that will increase the cost of capital to the oil industry significantly over time.
These are two great and thoughtful answers. We have here in the audience about to come on stage Jason Bordoff, the director of the Center on Global Energy Policy, Colin Fenton and Bob McNally, both of whom are non-resident fellows from the Center on Global Energy Policy. And these are three of the leading global experts on this topic. It's kind of like asking about physics with Einstein in the audience. So I think I will defer, and having put pressure on my colleagues, let them answer this question.
I'm certainly not going to weigh in after that.
So please join me in thanking our modest and also outstanding.
I wasn't going to weigh in